In the year 120 BC, a child stood at the edge of an empire's grave. He was 11 years old. His father's blood had barely dried on the marble floors of the palace at Sinope when the whispers began. Whispers that would echo through 3 decades of warfare, across mountains of corpses, through rivers of Roman blood, until they culminated in the most devastating single day of slaughter the ancient world had ever witnessed. His name was Mithridates, the 6th Eupator. In Greek, it meant beloved of his father. In Persian, it connected him to Darius the Great himself, to the bloodline that had once ruled from the Indus to the Aegean. But on that autumn day in 120 BC, standing in the shadow of his father's funeral pyre, young Mithridates was not thinking about ancient glories or divine ancestry. He was thinking about survival because someone in that palace wanted him dead. The court at Sinope was a serpent's nest of competing ambitions, and at its venomous center sat his own mother, Laodice VI. She had married her brother, according to the ancient customs of Hellenistic royalty, a practice designed to preserve the purity of divine bloodlines, but which in practice produced generations of paranoid, murderous relatives who viewed family members as obstacles rather than allies. Laodice had given birth to 2 sons, and she had made her preference devastatingly clear. The younger boy, Mithridates Crestus, would make a far more pliable king than his older brother. The evidence of her intentions accumulated with terrifying speed. Food that made the young king violently ill, hunting accidents that came within inches of ending his life, guards who looked the other way at crucial moments, servants who whispered warnings and then disappeared. The palace that should have been his sanctuary had become a killing ground, and Mithridates, barely old enough to understand the political complexities that surrounded him, understood one thing with absolute clarity. If he remained in Sinope, he would die. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, repeated in taverns and royal courts throughout the Mediterranean world for generations. The boy king vanished, not into exile at some foreign court, not into the protection of loyal nobles in distant provinces, but into the wild mountains of Pontus itself. For 7 years, Mithridates lived as a fugitive in his own kingdom, moving constantly through the rugged terrain that would later become his greatest military asset. He slept in caves and shepherds' huts. He ate what he could hunt or forage. He learned to read the land the way other princes learned to read Homer, memorizing every pass, every valley, every defensible position in the kingdom that was rightfully his. But he was not merely surviving, he was preparing. The physical transformation that occurred during these wilderness years was remarkable, even by the standards of ancient heroic narratives. Mithridates grew into a giant of a man. Contemporary sources describe him as exceptionally tall and powerfully built, with the aquiline features characteristic of his Persian ancestry, and a physical presence that commanded immediate attention in any gathering. He could outride any of his companions, requiring only a few hours of sleep each night, while maintaining a pace of activity that exhausted men twice his age. His endurance became legendary, his strength the subject of increasingly elaborate stories that spread throughout the Black Sea region. More significantly, he developed during these years the practice that would give his name to medical terminology for millennia to come: Mithridatism, the deliberate consumption of small doses of poison to build immunity, began as a survival strategy for a boy who knew that assassination by poison was the preferred method of royal murder in Hellenistic courts. But it evolved into something far more systematic, a comprehensive program of self-immunization that reportedly rendered the adult Mithridates immune to virtually every known toxic substance. He would later claim that he could drink hemlock like wine, that arsenic had no more effect on him than water, that the deadliest venoms of the ancient world passed through his system without consequence. Whether these claims were literally true or carefully cultivated propaganda, they served their purpose magnificently. The image of a king who could not be poisoned, who had conquered death itself through sheer force of will, became central to the mythology that Mithridates constructed around himself. He was not merely a ruler, he was something more than human, a figure who had passed through trials that would have destroyed ordinary men and emerged stronger, more dangerous, more determined than ever. The wilderness years also provided Mithridates with something that no amount of palace education could have supplied: intimate knowledge of the people who actually inhabited his kingdom. Pontus was not a homogeneous state but a complex tapestry of Greek coastal cities, indigenous Anatolian populations, Persian aristocratic families, and tribal communities in the mountainous interior who had maintained their independence through centuries of nominal submission to various imperial powers. The young king moved among all of these groups, learning their languages, understanding their grievances, building relationships that would prove invaluable when he finally emerged to claim his throne. The tribal chieftains of the Pontic interior were particularly important to his future plans. These men controlled the mountain passes and the warrior populations that would form the backbone of any serious military force. They had little love for the Greek-speaking court at Sinope, viewing the coastal aristocracy as effete foreigners who extracted tribute while providing nothing of value in return. Mithridates, appearing among them as a fellow survivor of the wilderness, speaking their languages and sharing their hardships, represented something entirely different: a king who understood their world and might actually serve their interests rather than merely exploiting their resources. By the time Mithridates was 18 years old, he had assembled a network of loyal supporters that extended throughout the Pontic interior, a personal guard of devoted followers who had shared his years of exile, and a detailed understanding of his kingdom's geography, population, and military potential that exceeded anything possessed by the court officials who nominally administered the realm. He had also developed the calculating intelligence and ruthless determination that would characterize his entire reign, qualities forged in the crucible of survival, tempered by years of constant danger, and focused with laser intensity on a single objective: the destruction of everyone who had threatened him, and the creation of an empire that would challenge Rome itself. The return to Sinope occurred sometime around 113 BC, and it was not a gradual reassertion of royal authority, but a sudden violent coup that demonstrated the full extent of Mithridates' capabilities. The details vary in different sources, but the essential elements are consistent. The young king appeared at the head of a substantial military force composed of tribal warriors and personal followers, seized control of the capital before his mother's faction could organize effective resistance, and immediately began the systematic elimination of everyone who had participated in the plots against his life. Laertes herself was arrested and imprisoned, eventually dying in captivity under circumstances that sources describe with careful ambiguity. Mithridates, Chrestus, the younger brother, who had been groomed as an alternative heir, was executed, along with the principal nobles who had supported his mother's faction. The purge extended throughout the court administration, removing not only active conspirators, but anyone whose loyalty might be questionable, anyone who had benefited from the previous regime, anyone who might potentially serve as a focal point for future opposition. The brutality of this consolidation was deliberate and calculated, designed to send an unmistakable message about the consequences of opposing the new king. Mithridates had learned during his years of exile that mercy toward enemies was a luxury that rulers in his position could not afford. The Hellenistic world was filled with examples of kings who had shown clemency to defeated rivals only to face renewed challenges when circumstances changed. He would not make that mistake. His enemies would be destroyed so completely that no possibility of future resistance would remain. But the young king's ambitions extended far beyond mere survival, or even the consolidation of power within Pontus. From the very beginning of his reign, Mithridates demonstrated a strategic vision that encompassed the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, a vision in which Pontus would not merely maintain its independence, but would expand to become the dominant power in the region, challenging and eventually replacing Roman authority throughout Asia Minor and beyond. This was not the fantasy of an inexperienced youth intoxicated by sudden power. Mithridates had spent his wilderness years not only building physical strength and political networks, but also studying the geopolitical situation of the world he intended to dominate. He understood that Roman power, while formidable, was not invincible. He had analyzed Roman military methods, identified their strengths and weaknesses, and begun developing strategies that might exploit the vulnerabilities he had discovered. Most importantly, he had recognized that Rome's position in the Eastern Mediterranean was far more precarious than it appeared, dependent on the cooperation of local populations who had grown increasingly resentful of Roman exploitation and might welcome an alternative if one presented itself. The geopolitical landscape of Asia Minor in the late 2nd century BC was indeed a complex tapestry of competing authorities and overlapping jurisdictions that created numerous opportunities for an ambitious ruler willing to exploit them. Roman power, established through the acquisition of the Attalid inheritance in 133 BC, centered on the new province of Asia, which encompassed much of western Anatolia. But Roman governance of this territory was characterized by the kind of short-term thinking and systematic exploitation that generated resentment rather than loyalty among subject populations. The Roman provincial system operated through governors who typically served one-year terms before returning to Rome to pursue their political careers. This rapid turnover prevented the development of consistent long-term policies, while creating powerful incentives for individual governors to extract maximum personal benefit during their brief tenures. The publicani, Roman tax farmers who purchased the right to collect specific taxes for predetermined periods, operated with minimal oversight, regularly demanding payments that exceeded official assessments and using their connections with Roman officials to suppress complaints and resistance. The practical consequences of this system were devastating for local populations. Small farmers found themselves forced into debt servitude when unable to meet arbitrary tax demands. Entire villages were dispossessed, their land seized and sold to Roman investors or local collaborators. The traditional social structures that had maintained stability for centuries began breaking down under the pressure of systematic exploitation. Even the prosperous Greek cities of the coast, Ephesus, Miletus, Pergamon, and dozens of others, found their ancient autonomy increasingly circumscribed by Roman financial demands and administrative interference. These economic pressures were compounded by cultural tensions that reflected deeper incompatibilities between Roman and Greek approaches to governance and social organization. Roman officials, trained in the pragmatic traditions of republican administration, often displayed little patience for the elaborate protocols and ceremonial observances that remained central to Greek civic life. The Greeks, for their part, found Roman directness and focus on immediate results crude and disrespectful of the philosophical and artistic achievements they considered the foundation of civilized society. Religious practices became another source of friction. While Rome generally maintained a policy of religious tolerance, the practical implementation often reflected Roman prejudices and misunderstandings. Traditional festivals requiring significant public expenditures came under scrutiny from officials concerned primarily with maximizing tax revenue. The appointment of priests and religious officials increasingly reflected Roman political considerations rather than local religious traditions. The accumulation of these grievances created a reservoir of anti-Roman sentiment that extended across all levels of society in Asia Minor. Wealthy Greeks resented the limitations placed on their traditional political authority. Urban craftsmen and merchants found their economic opportunities constrained by Roman competition and regulatory interference. Rural populations faced the immediate threat of dispossession and enslavement. This widespread discontent did not immediately translate into organized resistance, largely because no credible alternative to Roman rule appeared available, but it created conditions that a sufficiently capable leader might exploit. Mithridates recognized these conditions with the clarity of someone who had spent years studying his potential enemies and their vulnerabilities. He understood that Roman power in Asia Minor was not based on genuine loyalty or cultural integration, but on military force and the absence of alternatives. If he could demonstrate that alternatives existed, if he could present himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror, as the restorer of Greek freedom rather than merely another foreign ruler, he might be able to transform the simmering resentment of Roman subjects into active support for Pontic expansion. But first, he needed to build the military and economic foundations that would make such a challenge possible. The Pontus he had inherited was a significant regional power, but hardly capable of confronting Rome directly. His initial years as king were therefore devoted to systematic expansion that would provide the resources and strategic positions necessary for eventual confrontation with the Mediterranean world's dominant power. The Kingdom of Pontus occupied a unique position within the regional framework of Asia Minor. Emerging in the early 3rd century BC, when Mithridates I, a Persian nobleman, established independence in the wake of Alexander's conquests, successive rulers had gradually expanded Pontic territory along the southern shore of the Black Sea, incorporating Greek coastal cities and indigenous Anatolian populations. By the time of Mithridates VI's succession, Pontus controlled a strategic position linking Black Sea trade routes with the interior of Asia Minor, generating substantial revenue from customs duties and commercial activities. But the kingdom's true potential lay in its geographic position as a gateway to the vast resources of the Black Sea region and the territories beyond. To the east lay Colchis, the legendary homeland of Medea, rich in gold and other precious metals. To the north, across the Black Sea, lay the Crimean Bosporus, where Greek cities controlled the vital grain trade between the Scythian territories and the Mediterranean world. To the south and west lay the patchwork of client kingdoms and autonomous cities that separated Pontus from direct Roman control. Mithridates' expansion began with Colchis, a region that had maintained nominal independence under local rulers while serving as a crucial link in trade networks connecting the Mediterranean world with the Caucasus and Central Asia. The conquest required careful planning and execution, combining diplomacy, economic pressure, and strategic marriages with coordinated military campaigns that exploited Pontic naval superiority. Local chieftains were offered advantageous trading arrangements and positions within the expanding Pontic administrative system. Those who resisted faced systematic military pressure that gradually eliminated all opposition. The incorporation of Colchis brought immediate strategic benefits. Control of the region's gold mines provided substantial new revenue streams, while access to Caucasian trade routes opened opportunities for expansion into previously untapped markets. Perhaps most importantly, Colchis served as a launching point for further expansion into the Crimean Bosporus, where Greek cities had maintained precarious independence for centuries while paying tribute to various Scythian and Sarmatian tribes. The Crimean intervention represented Mithridates' most audacious early venture and demonstrated the sophisticated combination of military force and diplomatic manipulation that would characterize his entire reign. The Greek cities of Pantikapaeum and Chersonesus controlled the vital grain trade between the Scythian territories north of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean world. For centuries, these cities had maintained their independence through military strength, diplomatic skill, and regular tribute payments to local barbarian tribes. But by the late 2nd century BC, the traditional balance of power had become increasingly unstable. Scythian power was waning under pressure from Sarmatian tribes migrating westward from the steppes, while the Greek cities found themselves unable to maintain military forces sufficient to guarantee continued independence. Appeals to various Mediterranean powers for assistance had yielded little concrete support, creating an opportunity that Mithridates was quick to exploit. The Pontic intervention began with diplomatic overtures offering military assistance against barbarian raids in exchange for commercial privileges and naval bases. When negotiations proved insufficient, Mithridates dispatched a substantial military force under his most trusted general, Diophantus. The subsequent campaigns, fought across the difficult terrain of the Crimean Peninsula and the surrounding steppes, demonstrated the effectiveness of Pontic military organization and the king's strategic vision. Diophantus's forces, combining Pontic heavy infantry with local auxiliaries and allied tribal cavalry, proved superior to both the declining Scythian armies and the limited forces the Greek cities could field independently. The capture of key strategic points along the coastline allowed Pontic forces to establish permanent bases, while successful campaigns against hostile tribes secured the land routes connecting the Crimean cities with their agricultural hinterlands. The incorporation of the Bosporan territories represented a triumph of strategic planning and military execution. Control of the region's grain exports provided Mithridates with both substantial revenue and a powerful diplomatic weapon that could be wielded against any Mediterranean power dependent on Black Sea agricultural products. The Greek cities themselves, with their experienced naval forces and established commercial networks, became valuable assets in the king's growing confrontation with Roman power. Lesser Armenia fell next, following a similar pattern of gradual infiltration and eventual annexation. This mountainous region, located between Pontus proper and the larger Armenian kingdom ruled by the Artaxia dynasty, had long served as a buffer zone between competing powers. Local Armenian nobles, facing pressure from both the expanding Parthian Empire to the east and the growing power of Greater Armenia to the north, proved receptive to Pontic overtures promising protection and profitable alliances. Mithridates' approach to Lesser Armenia demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of regional politics and cultural sensitivities. Rather than imposing direct Pontic rule, he initially established a protectorate system that preserved local Armenian institutions while ensuring Pontic control over foreign policy and military affairs. This arrangement allowed him to tap into the region's considerable military potential. Armenian heavy cavalry and infantry had long been renowned throughout the Near East, while avoiding the administrative burdens and potential resistance that direct annexation might have provoked. By the mid-90s BC, Mithridates had transformed Pontus from a regional power into an empire that controlled territories spanning from the Caucasus to the borders of Roman Asia, from the northern shores of the Black Sea to the mountains of Armenia. His military forces systematically expanded and improved throughout this period of consolidation, numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and included specialized units recruited from throughout the Black Sea region. His treasury, filled with the proceeds of Colchian gold mines and Bosporan grain exports, provided resources sufficient to sustain prolonged military operations against any opponent. More importantly, he had constructed an intelligence network that extended throughout the Roman world, providing detailed information about military dispositions, political developments, and the extent of anti-Roman sentiment in various communities. His agents, typically Greeks or Persians fluent in local languages and familiar with regional customs, operated with considerable discretion, gathering the intelligence that would allow Mithridates to develop detailed plans for coordinated action against Roman authority when the appropriate moment arrived. That moment was approaching faster than anyone in Rome could have imagined. The conditions that would make Mithridates' challenge to Roman authority so devastatingly effective were already in place, waiting only for the spark that would ignite 3 decades of warfare and transform the political landscape of the ancient world forever. The game board was set. The pieces were in position, and Mithridates, the 6th Eupator, the boy who had survived assassination attempts and 7 years of wilderness exile, the king who could not be poisoned, the ruler who had built an empire through cunning and ruthlessness and sheer force of will, was ready to make his move. Rome had no idea what was coming. The death of Nicomedes, the third of Bithynia, in 94 BC, sent tremors through every royal court in Asia Minor. The Bithynian succession crisis that followed would prove to be the match that ignited the powder keg Mithridates had spent 2 decades preparing. Nicomedes had been a loyal Roman client, maintaining the delicate balance between genuine subservience and nominal independence that characterized Rome's relationship with its eastern allies. His death left 2 claimants to the throne: Nicomedes IV, the legitimate heir who enjoyed Roman support, and his half-brother Socrates, who had cultivated connections with anti-Roman factions throughout the region. The situation in neighboring Cappadocia was equally unstable, with the death of King Ariarathes VII triggering a parallel succession dispute that exposed the fundamental weakness of Rome's client kingdom system. Mithridates observed these developments with the calculating eye of a chess master watching his opponent's pieces fall into vulnerable positions. The Roman position in both kingdoms was precarious, dependent on local support that could evaporate if alternative leadership emerged. More importantly, Roman military resources in the region remained limited, with most legions committed to campaigns in Gaul, Spain, and other frontier regions. The proconsular forces stationed in Asia consisted primarily of auxiliary troops and local levies of questionable loyalty, hardly sufficient to maintain control if faced with coordinated resistance. The king's diplomatic offensive began in earnest during 91 BC. Embassies were dispatched to both Cappadocia and Bithynia, offering military assistance to the rival claimants opposed by Rome. These negotiations, conducted with characteristic Pontic discretion, promised substantial financial support and military advisors in exchange for formal alliances that would effectively place both kingdoms within Mithridates' sphere of influence. The terms offered were deliberately generous, reflecting the king's understanding that initial investment in reliable allies would yield far greater returns once Roman authority had been eliminated from the region. Roman intelligence services, such as they were, failed to detect the full scope of these diplomatic maneuvers until events had progressed beyond the point where peaceful resolution remained possible. The consul Manius Aquilius, dispatched to Asia Minor with a small force to resolve the succession disputes, discovered that both kingdoms were already effectively under Pontic influence by the time he arrived. His attempts to negotiate directly with Mithridates through traditional diplomatic channels met with polite but evasive responses that suggested the Pontic king was merely buying time while completing his military preparations. The breakdown of diplomatic negotiations occurred during a series of meetings held at various locations along the Pontic-Cappadocian border throughout the winter of 90 to 89 BC. Aquilius, operating under instructions from the Senate to resolve the crisis without committing substantial Roman resources, found himself in the impossible position of making threats he lacked the military capacity to enforce. Mithridates, fully aware of Roman limitations, responded to each ultimatum with counter-proposals that would have effectively recognized Pontic hegemony over the disputed territories while maintaining the fiction of Roman oversight. The final diplomatic exchange took place in early 89 BC. Aquilius delivered what amounted to an ultimatum. Mithridates must withdraw all support from the rival claimants and recognize Roman authority over both succession disputes. The Pontic king's response, delivered through his ambassador Pelopidas, was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that could not disguise its fundamental rejection of Roman demands. Mithridates would consider withdrawing from Cappadocia only if Rome simultaneously recognized Pontic sovereignty over territories that included most of northern and eastern Asia Minor, terms that no Roman official could possibly accept without effectively abandoning the province of Asia. With diplomatic options exhausted, both sides began final preparations for military action. Aquilius, recognizing that his forces were inadequate for the coming conflict, dispatched urgent requests to Rome for reinforcements while attempting to organize local resistance from the client kingdoms and Greek cities still nominally loyal to Roman authority. His efforts were hampered by the widespread recognition that Roman military resources in the region were insufficient to guarantee protection for communities that openly supported the Roman cause. Mithridates launched his offensive in the spring of 88 BC with a coordinated assault that demonstrated years of careful planning and preparation. Rather than advancing directly against Roman positions, he began by securing his flanks through simultaneous invasions of Bithynia and Cappadocia that eliminated the rival claimants supported by Rome and installed his own candidates on both thrones. These campaigns, executed by separate armies under the command of experienced Pontic generals, achieved their objectives within weeks, while Roman forces remained concentrated around their primary bases in Western Asia Minor. The speed of Pontic success reflected both superior intelligence and more effective logistics. Mithridates had spent years cultivating relationships with local commanders and administrators in both kingdoms, ensuring that resistance would be minimal when his forces finally advanced. The armies themselves represented the culmination of decades of military reform and expansion, combining traditional Pontic heavy infantry with specialized units recruited from throughout the Black Sea region and equipped with the finest weapons and armor that royal workshops could produce. The Bithynian campaign unfolded with particular efficiency. Pontic forces advancing from multiple directions converged on the capital at Nicomedia, while naval units secured the coastal cities that might otherwise have served as bases for Roman counterattacks. King Nicomedes IV, faced with the choice between flight and capture, abandoned his kingdom and fled to Roman protection, leaving his supporters to face Pontic retribution without royal leadership. The installation of Socrates as the new Bithynian king was accomplished through a carefully orchestrated ceremony that emphasized continuity with traditional royal customs, while making clear the kingdom's new orientation toward Pontus rather than Rome. Cappadocia proved even more receptive to Pontic intervention. Years of Roman interference in internal affairs had generated substantial resentment among the traditional nobility. The elimination of Ariarathes was accomplished through a combination of military pressure and political maneuvering that left Gordius, Mithridates' ally, in undisputed control of the kingdom. The new king immediately signed a formal alliance with Pontus that granted Mithridates access to Cappadocian military resources and strategic positions along the kingdom's southern borders. With his flanks secured and reliable allies installed in both neighboring kingdoms, Mithridates turned his attention to the main prize, the Roman province of Asia. The campaign that followed would demonstrate not only the king's military capabilities, but also the extent of anti-Roman sentiment that had been building throughout the region for decades. Rather than relying solely on Pontic forces, Mithridates had coordinated his invasion with a network of local supporters who were prepared to rise against Roman authority once Pontic military success seemed assured. The invasion of Asia began with simultaneous assaults on multiple fronts, designed to prevent Roman forces from concentrating their limited resources for effective resistance. The main Pontic army, numbering approximately 250,000 infantry and 40,000 cavalry according to contemporary sources, advanced westward from Cappadocia, while smaller forces moved south from Bithynia, and additional units landed at various points along the coastline. This multi-pronged assault forced Roman commanders to divide their already inadequate forces, while dealing with uprisings in their rear areas as local populations welcomed the Pontic advance. The fall of Pergamon, the former Attalid capital and one of the most important cities in the province, occurred within days of the invasion's commencement. The city's Greek population, resentful of decades of Roman exploitation, opened the gates to Pontic forces while the small Roman garrison retreated to the citadel before surrendering when their position became untenable. Mithridates' entry into Pergamon was orchestrated as a deliberate contrast to Roman administrative practices, with the king presenting himself as a liberator restoring traditional Greek freedoms rather than a conqueror imposing foreign rule. The enthusiastic reception that Mithridates received throughout the Greek cities of Asia Minor reflected genuine popular support rather than mere opportunism. Decades of Roman taxation and administrative interference had created widespread resentment that transcended class boundaries, uniting wealthy merchants and poor craftsmen in opposition to continued Roman rule. The king's agents had prepared the ground carefully, circulating propaganda that portrayed the Pontic advance as the restoration of Greek independence and the fulfillment of ancient prophecies about the eventual overthrow of Roman tyranny. Ephesus, the largest and most prosperous city in the province, surrendered without resistance when Pontic forces appeared before its walls. The city's population had already expelled the Roman tax farmers and their local collaborators, seizing their property and establishing a provisional government that immediately declared allegiance to Mithridates. Similar scenes were repeated throughout the region as communities that had maintained sullen submission to Roman authority for decades suddenly erupted in celebration at the prospect of liberation. The collapse of Roman military resistance proceeded with shocking rapidity. Garrison after garrison found itself isolated and outnumbered by hostile local populations. Many Roman commanders, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, negotiated surrender terms that allowed them to withdraw with their personal effects, while abandoning their official positions and military equipment to Pontic forces. Others attempted to maintain control through increasingly desperate measures, including the execution of suspected collaborators and the imposition of martial law. But these efforts only served to further alienate local populations and accelerate the general uprising. Aquilius himself, caught in the provincial capital when the city fell, managed to escape with a small bodyguard, but found himself unable to rally effective resistance anywhere in the province. His attempts to reach the coast and secure passage to Rome were frustrated by the universal hostility of the local population and the presence of Pontic naval units that had seized control of most major ports. The former consul's eventual capture near the Bithynian border marked the effective end of organized Roman resistance in Asia Minor. But Mithridates was not finished. The most shocking event of the entire campaign, the event that would transform a regional conflict into an existential struggle between civilizations, was yet to come, and when it came, it would change everything. What happened next would become the single most horrifying day in the history of the ancient Mediterranean world. It would be remembered for centuries It would be studied by military strategists and condemned by moralists. It would ensure that the war between Mithridates and Rome could never end in negotiation or compromise, only in the complete destruction of one side or the other. The Ephesian Vespers, secret orders had been distributed throughout the region weeks in advance, coordinated to ensure simultaneous execution across hundreds of cities and towns. The instructions were explicit and comprehensive, leaving no room for interpretation or mercy. On a single designated day in 88 BC, every Roman and Italian civilian residing in Asia Minor was to be killed. Every man, every woman, every child, regardless of age, regardless of social status, regardless of how long they had lived in the region, regardless of whether they had been born in Asia Minor to parents who had never seen Italy, regardless of whether they had married into Greek families, learned Greek customs, worshipped Greek gods. If Roman or Italian blood flowed in their veins, they were to die. The massacre began at dawn in Ephesus and spread throughout the province like a wave of blood. Local populations, armed with lists of Roman residents that Pontic agents had spent months preparing, conducted house-to-house searches to identify and eliminate their targets. The killing was not random violence, but carefully organized genocide, designed to eliminate any possibility of Roman resurgence in the region. Entire families were dragged from their homes and murdered in public squares, while crowds of Greek citizens watched and cheered. Roman merchants who had lived in Asia Minor for decades, their children who had been born in Greek cities, elderly veterans who had settled in the province after completing military service, all were killed without distinction or mercy. The methods varied from city to city, reflecting local customs and the particular hatreds that had accumulated over decades of Roman occupation. In some places, the killing was swift, throats cut, bodies thrown into mass graves. In others, it was prolonged and theatrical, with victims subjected to public torture before death as crowds gathered to witness the spectacle. In Ephesus itself, Romans who fled to the Temple of Artemis seeking sanctuary were dragged from the sacred precinct and slaughtered on the temple steps, their blood staining the marble that had witnessed centuries of worship. The scale of the slaughter was unprecedented in the ancient world. Contemporary sources, including both Pontic sympathizers and later Roman historians, agree that approximately 80,000 Roman and Italian civilians perished in a single day across Asia Minor. 80,000. The number is almost impossible to comprehend. It represents not merely a military defeat, but the systematic elimination of an entire population: men, women, children, the elderly, the sick, the innocent, and the guilty alike. The killing was not limited to major cities, but extended to small towns and rural areas where even isolated Roman families were hunted down and eliminated. Pontic agents had spent months identifying Roman residents and their properties, creating detailed lists that were distributed to local leaders, along with specific instructions for carrying out the massacre. The timing was coordinated to prevent any Romans from escaping to warn others, while the comprehensiveness of the operation ensured that potential sources of future resistance were eliminated completely. The participation of local populations was not merely passive acceptance but active enthusiasm. Decades of accumulated grievances, economic exploitation, cultural humiliation, religious interference, arbitrary taxation, found their outlet in a single day of cathartic violence. Greek citizens who had smiled at their Roman neighbors for years, who had conducted business with them and attended the same festivals, now turned on them with a fury that shocked even Pontic officials who had organized the massacre. Some Greeks attempted to protect Roman friends or business partners, hiding them in cellars or smuggling them out of cities under cover of darkness. These acts of individual courage were rare and dangerous. Anyone caught sheltering Romans faced the same fate as their guests. The few survivors who eventually made their way to Roman-controlled territories carried with them stories of betrayal and horror that would fuel Roman hatred for generations. The psychological impact of the Ephesian Vespers extended far beyond its immediate military significance. The massacre demonstrated that Mithridates was prepared to wage total war against Roman authority, rejecting the traditional limitations that had governed conflicts between civilized powers. The king's willingness to order the systematic murder of civilians, including women and children, marked a fundamental escalation in the nature of the conflict and guaranteed that any eventual Roman response would be equally ruthless. News of the massacre reached Rome several weeks later, carried by the few survivors who had managed to escape the slaughter and make their way to Roman-controlled territories. The initial reports were dismissed as exaggerated accounts of routine military violence, but subsequent confirmations from multiple sources forced Roman authorities to confront the reality that an entire provincial population had been eliminated in a coordinated act of genocide. The Senate's response combined genuine shock at the scale of the atrocity with recognition that Roman prestige throughout the Mediterranean world had suffered a devastating blow. Rome had built its empire on the promise of protection, the assurance that Roman citizenship and Italian origin provided security anywhere in the known world. That promise had been shattered in a single day. If Rome could not protect its citizens in Asia Minor, how could it guarantee their safety anywhere else? The political implications were equally devastating. Roman investors had lost fortunes in the massacre, not only the publicani who had been primary targets of popular hatred, but merchants, bankers, and landowners who had established businesses throughout the province. These financial losses translated into political pressure as wealthy equestrians demanded vengeance against the king, who had destroyed their investments and murdered their agents. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the Ephesian Vespers was the transformation of the conflict from a territorial dispute into a war of extermination. Before the massacre, negotiated settlement remained theoretically possible. Mithridates might have been forced to withdraw from conquered territories and pay indemnities, but he could have retained his throne and his kingdom. After the massacre, such outcomes became unthinkable. Rome could not accept any peace that left Mithridates in power without appearing to condone the murder of 80,000 of its citizens. The war would continue until one side or the other was completely destroyed. Mithridates understood this perfectly. The massacre was not an act of spontaneous violence or uncontrolled hatred, but a calculated strategic decision designed to eliminate any possibility of compromise. By making himself Rome's implacable enemy, by committing an atrocity so monstrous that forgiveness was impossible, the king had ensured that his Greek subjects could not defect back to Rome without facing the same fate they had inflicted on Roman civilians. They were bound to him now by shared guilt, complicit in a crime that Rome would never forgive. The collapse of Roman authority in Asia Minor created a power vacuum that Mithridates moved quickly to fill with his own administrative system. Rather than simply occupying conquered territory, the king implemented a comprehensive program of political and economic reform designed to consolidate local support while extracting maximum resources for the continuing war effort. Greek cities were granted extensive autonomy and encouraged to revive traditional democratic institutions that had been suppressed under Roman rule. New commercial arrangements promised greater prosperity through integration with Pontic trade networks. The oppressive tax system that had characterized Roman rule was immediately abolished and replaced with more moderate assessments that still provided substantial revenue for the royal treasury, while allowing local communities to retain sufficient resources for recovery and growth. The king's administrative appointments reflected careful attention to local sensibilities and political dynamics. Former Roman collaborators were eliminated or forced into exile, but established Greek families with histories of opposition to Roman rule were elevated to positions of authority within the new provincial government. This approach helped legitimize Pontic rule while ensuring that local administration would be conducted by individuals with genuine stakes in the success of the new regime. Confiscated Roman properties were redistributed to Greek citizens who had suffered under the previous regime, creating a substantial constituency with direct interests in preventing any restoration of Roman authority. These economic policies demonstrated Mithridates' sophisticated understanding of the relationship between popular support and material prosperity, a lesson that Roman administrators had never bothered to learn. The military implications of Mithridates' conquest extended far beyond the immediate territorial gains. Control of Asia Minor provided access to substantial human and material resources that could be mobilized for future campaigns, while the elimination of Roman naval bases along the Asian coast left the eastern Mediterranean largely undefended against Pontic expansion. The king's forces now controlled strategic positions that could threaten Roman interests throughout the region, from the grain supply routes connecting Egypt with Italy to the commercial networks that linked Roman territories with Eastern markets. Roman attempts to organize effective resistance from their remaining strongholds in Greece and the Western Mediterranean were hampered by the speed of Pontic's success and the comprehensive nature of the regional uprising. The few Roman officials who had escaped the initial conquest found themselves without reliable local support or adequate military resources to mount credible counterattacks. Appeals to allied communities throughout the Mediterranean world yielded limited assistance, as potential supporters recognized that Roman power in the east had suffered a potentially fatal blow. The strategic situation facing Rome in late 88 BC represented the most serious external threat to the Republic since Hannibal's invasion of Italy 2 centuries earlier. An enemy power had not only conquered substantial Roman territory, but had demonstrated the capacity to inspire coordinated resistance among populations that had previously accepted Roman rule. The systematic elimination of Roman civilians throughout Asia Minor had created conditions that made any negotiated settlement impossible, while guaranteeing that the eventual Roman response would be conducted with unprecedented ruthlessness and determination. The stage was set for one of the most brutal conflicts in ancient history, and the man Rome would send to wage that war was about to demonstrate that when it came to ruthlessness, Mithridates had finally met his match. The catastrophic news from Asia Minor reached Rome during the autumn of 88 BC, arriving at a moment when the Republic was already convulsing with internal political violence that would fundamentally alter the course of the Eastern War. The consul Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician of ancient lineage, whose family had fallen into relative obscurity before his own military successes revived their fortunes, found himself at the center of competing claims for command of the forces that would be dispatched to restore Roman authority in the East. Sulla was not a man who inspired affection. Cold, calculating, and possessed of a cruelty that would become legendary, he had risen through the Roman military system by demonstrating both tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness in pursuit of his objectives. His face, marked by a distinctive reddish complexion that his enemies attributed to excessive drinking and his supporters to the fires of ambition, had become familiar throughout the Roman world as the visage of a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. The Senate, recognizing both the magnitude of the threat posed by Mithridates and Sulla's proven military capabilities demonstrated during the social war against Italian allies, formally assigned him command of the Eastern expedition with imperium sufficient to conduct operations throughout the Mediterranean world. Sulla's appointment represented a calculated decision by the conservative faction within the Senate, who viewed the patrician general as a reliable defender of traditional republican institutions against the populist challenges that had been mounting throughout the late 2nd century. But Sulla's appointment was immediately challenged by the most celebrated military commander of the previous generation, Gaius Marius. The aging general, whose victories over Jugurtha and the Cimbri had made him the most famous Roman soldier of his era, emerged from political retirement to challenge Sulla's appointment through manipulation of the popular assemblies. The tribune Publius Sulpicius Rufus introduced legislation transferring command of the eastern expedition from Sulla to Marius, arguing that the crisis required the leadership of Rome's most experienced general, rather than a commander whose victories had been achieved primarily against Italian, rather than foreign enemies. The political maneuvering that followed revealed the depth of factional divisions that had been developing within the Roman political system throughout the previous decades. Sulla's supporters, concentrated among the traditional senatorial aristocracy, argued that legally granted imperium could not be arbitrarily transferred through popular legislation without setting dangerous precedents for future challenges to constitutional authority. Marius and his allies, drawing support from urban plebs and rural populations that had benefited from his previous military settlements, maintained that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary measures. The crisis escalated when Sulla, rather than accepting the popular assembly's decision, chose to march on Rome with the legions that had been assembled for the Eastern campaign. No Roman general had ever led armed forces against the capital itself. The 6 legions under his command, composed primarily of veterans from the social war who maintained personal loyalty to their commander, advanced on Rome while Sulla issued proclamations declaring his intention to restore legitimate governmental authority. The brief civil conflict that followed demonstrated both the fragility of republican institutions and the extent to which personal loyalties had begun to supersede constitutional obligations within the Roman military system. Marius and his supporters, lacking organized military forces within the city, attempted to organize resistance through hastily armed urban militias and gladiatorial bands. But these improvised forces proved no match for disciplined legions commanded by experienced officers. The fighting that occurred within Rome itself was limited in scope, but shocking in its implications, as Roman citizens found themselves engaged in armed conflict with their own military forces. Sulla's victory was complete but Pyrrhic. The precedent of marching on Rome would haunt the Republic for the remainder of its existence. Marius and his principal supporters fled into exile, while Sulla implemented a series of constitutional reforms designed to strengthen senatorial authority and prevent future challenges to legally constituted government. With his domestic position temporarily secured, Sulla departed for the east in early 87 BC, leaving behind a political situation that remained fundamentally unstable despite his recent victory. The consul's absence from Rome would provide opportunities for his enemies to organize resistance, while the demands of the Eastern campaign prevented him from maintaining direct oversight of domestic political developments. The Roman expeditionary force that crossed from Brundisium to Apollonia in the spring of 87 BC represented one of the largest military concentrations the Republic had assembled for foreign operations since the Punic Wars. 5 legions of heavy infantry, approximately 30,000 men, formed the core of Sulla's army, supported by substantial auxiliary forces recruited from Italian allies and supplemented by specialized units, including Balearic slingers, Cretan archers, and Gallic cavalry. Sulla's arrival in Epirus coincided with disturbing intelligence reports indicating that Pontic influence had spread far beyond the initial conquest in Asia Minor. Mithridates had dispatched substantial forces under the command of his general Archelaus to secure control of key strategic positions throughout Greece, while Pontic agents had been active in encouraging anti-Roman sentiment among Greek communities that retained bitter memories of previous Roman interventions. The situation in Athens was particularly alarming. The democratic faction led by Aristion had seized control of the city and declared allegiance to Pontus, while similar uprisings had occurred in other major Greek centers. Archelaus had landed substantial forces at Piraeus and was using the port as a base for operations throughout central Greece, while additional Pontic forces were reportedly advancing through Thrace toward Macedonia. Sulla recognized that allowing these forces to establish permanent positions would create a strategic threat to Roman interests throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while providing Mithridates with forward bases for potential operations against Italy itself. The siege of Athens that commenced in the autumn of 87 BC would demonstrate both Sulla's tactical capabilities and his willingness to employ extreme measures to achieve military objectives. The city's formidable fortifications, strengthened during previous centuries of warfare, presented a significant challenge to Roman siege techniques, while the presence of Pontic naval forces at Piraeus complicated any attempt to establish a complete blockade. Sulla's approach combined traditional siege methods with innovative tactical adaptations designed to exploit specific weaknesses in Athenian defensive arrangements. The Roman siege lines, constructed according to established military engineering principles, completely encircled both Athens and its port at Piraeus, while maintaining secure communications between the two investment forces. These fortifications, built by legionary engineers under the supervision of experienced military architects, included elaborate systems of trenches, palisades, and artillery positions that prevented any relief efforts while protecting Roman forces from sorties by the besieged garrison. Sulla's conduct of the siege revealed his understanding that psychological warfare could be as effective as physical assault in achieving military objectives. Rather than attempting immediate assault on the city's walls, he implemented a systematic program of intimidation designed to undermine civilian morale while demonstrating the futility of continued resistance. Roman artillery, including both traditional catapults and new torsion engines, maintained constant bombardment of residential areas within the city, while public executions of captured Pontic sympathizers provided graphic demonstrations of the fate awaiting those who opposed Roman authority. The gradual tightening of the siege created increasingly desperate conditions within Athens, as food supplies dwindled and disease began spreading through the overcrowded population. Aristion's government, initially confident that Pontic relief forces would break the Roman blockade, found itself unable to maintain civilian support as the reality of their situation became apparent. Attempts to negotiate surrender terms were rejected by Sulla, who demanded unconditional capitulation and the surrender of all Pontic supporters for punishment as traitors to Roman authority. The final assault on Athens began before dawn on March 1st, 86 BC, when Roman forces simultaneously attacked multiple sections of the city's walls, while diversionary operations prevented the garrison from concentrating their defensive efforts. The main attack, directed against the Piraeus Gate, where previous bombardment had weakened the fortifications, achieved breakthrough within hours as legionary infantry overwhelmed the demoralized defenders. Once Roman forces had established positions within the city, organized resistance collapsed as civilians fled toward the Acropolis, while Pontic soldiers attempted to escape toward the harbor. What followed was one of the most brutal episodes in the history of Roman warfare. Sulla permitted his troops to engage in systematic pillaging and massacre that continued for 3 days. The general's decision to allow this violence reflected both his desire to punish the city for its betrayal of Roman authority and his recognition that examples of extreme brutality would discourage resistance in other Greek communities. Thousands of civilians were killed regardless of their political affiliations. The city's artistic and cultural treasures, accumulated over centuries of Athenian greatness, were either destroyed or shipped to Rome as spoils of war. The systematic elimination of the city's intellectual and cultural elite, including philosophers, artists, and scholars who had maintained Athens' reputation as the center of Greek learning, demonstrated that Rome would tolerate no challenges to its authority, regardless of the cultural significance of the communities involved. The destruction of Athens sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world. Communities that had been considering alignment with Pontus recognized the consequences of opposing Roman power. The message was unmistakable. Rome would match Mithridates' brutality measure for measure, atrocity for atrocity, until one side or the other was completely destroyed. War had become a contest of horrors, and it was only beginning. With Athens secured and Pontic naval power in the Aegean significantly reduced, Sulla turned his attention to the elimination of remaining enemy forces in central Greece. Archelaus, having escaped from Piraeus with substantial portions of his army, had established new positions in Boeotia, where he hoped to await reinforcements from Asia Minor while organizing resistance among Greek communities that remained hostile to Roman authority. The Pontic general's forces, estimated at approximately 110,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, represented a formidable challenge that would require careful tactical planning to overcome. Archelaus had positioned his army in a strong defensive position that took advantage of the local terrain, while allowing maximum deployment of his superior numbers. The Battle of Chaeronea, fought on the plains of central Boeotia in the summer of 86 BC, would demonstrate the tactical superiority of Roman military organization over the diverse forces that Mithridates had assembled for his Greek campaign. Sulla commanded approximately 30,000 troops, outnumbered nearly 4 to 1. By any conventional military calculation, the Romans should have been destroyed. The Pontic army included not only traditional infantry formations, but also the fearsome scythed chariots that had terrorized enemies throughout the ancient Near East, along with substantial cavalry forces and specialized units recruited from throughout the Black Sea region. But Sulla was not a conventional commander. His tactical approach reflected systematic analysis of Pontic military capabilities, combined with innovations designed to exploit specific weaknesses in enemy deployments. Rather than attempting direct assault against the Pontic defensive positions, Roman forces implemented coordinated maneuvers that drew enemy units into unfavorable engagements while maintaining sufficient cohesion to resist counterattacks. The battle began with a Pontic cavalry charge, intended to overwhelm the Roman flanks before the legions could deploy into their characteristic formations. Sulla had anticipated this tactic and positioned his forces accordingly, with auxiliary units screening the main body, while legionary cohorts formed the defensive squares that had proven so effective against cavalry attacks throughout Roman military history. The Pontic cavalry, unable to break the Roman formations, withdrew to regroup, and in doing so, created gaps in their own lines that Sulla immediately exploited. Roman infantry advanced in disciplined formations, their short swords and heavy shields proving devastatingly effective against the longer weapons and lighter armor of their opponents. The scythed chariots, Archelaus's secret weapon, proved worse than useless. Roman engineers had prepared the battlefield with concealed ditches and obstacles that disrupted the chariots' momentum, while disciplined legionaries simply opened their ranks to let the vehicles pass through before closing again to continue their advance. The chariots that did reach Roman lines found their crews cut down by soldiers who had been trained specifically to counter this threat. The collapse of the Pontic center occurred within hours of the initial engagement. Archelaus's attempts to rally his forces were frustrated by the chaos that resulted from the Roman breakthrough, as units that had been positioned to support each other found themselves isolated and overwhelmed by coordinated Roman attacks. The Roman victory at Chaeronea was complete and devastating. Contemporary sources describe Pontic losses exceeding 100,000 casualties, virtually the entire army destroyed in a single afternoon. Roman losses, by contrast, numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands, a disparity that demonstrated the continued effectiveness of Roman tactical methods against even numerically superior opponents. But Archelaus was not finished. The Pontic general escaped with the remnants of his forces and received substantial reinforcements from Asia Minor, rebuilding his army to approximately 80,000 troops within months of the Chaeronea disaster. The second major engagement of the Greek campaign, the Battle of Orchomenus, would prove equally decisive. Sulla, recognizing that his forces were exhausted from the previous campaign, and that Pontic reinforcements continued to arrive, chose to fight a defensive battle that would force Archelaus to attack prepared Roman positions. The Roman commander selected his ground carefully, positioning his forces on terrain that neutralized Pontic cavalry advantages, while providing natural obstacles that would disrupt enemy formations. The battle that followed was even more brutal than Chaeronea. Pontic forces, desperate to achieve the victory that had eluded them in the previous engagement, launched repeated assaults against Roman positions that resulted in catastrophic casualties without achieving breakthrough. Sulla's legions, fighting from prepared defensive works, inflicted devastating losses on each successive wave of attackers while maintaining their own cohesion and discipline. The turning point came when Sulla personally led a counterattack against the Pontic center, rallying wavering troops with a display of personal courage that became legendary throughout the Roman world. The general, sword in hand, fought in the front ranks alongside his soldiers, an act of leadership that inspired his men to superhuman efforts while demoralizing enemies who had expected to face a commander directing operations from the rear. The destruction of Archelaus's second army at Orchomenus effectively ended Pontic military power in Greece. The survivors, perhaps 10,000 men from an original force of 80,000, fled toward the coast where Pontic naval forces still maintained tenuous control over several harbors. Sulla's pursuit was methodical and relentless, as Roman columns advanced along multiple routes to prevent the enemy from establishing new defensive positions. The strategic implications of Sulla's Greek victories extended far beyond their immediate military gains. News of Roman success began reversing the tide of regional opinion that had initially favored Pontic expansion. Greek communities that had welcomed Mithridates as a liberator now recognized that Roman power remained formidable and that continued resistance would likely result in the same brutal punishment that had befallen Athens. Delegations from various cities began arriving at Sulla's headquarters, offering submission and requesting terms for renewed alliance with Rome. Intelligence reports indicated growing dissension within Pontic-controlled territories as local populations reconsidered their allegiances. The psychological impact of Roman success encouraged pro-Roman factions throughout Asia Minor, while discouraging further rebellions against Roman authority. The diplomatic offensive that accompanied Roman military success reflected Sulla's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military victory and political consolidation. Rather than simply accepting surrenders and moving forward with military operations, he implemented a comprehensive program designed to rebuild Roman authority throughout Greece while creating conditions that would prevent future rebellions. Communities that had remained loyal to Rome throughout the crisis received substantial rewards, including tax reductions, territorial grants, and enhanced autonomy. Those that had supported Pontus faced varying degrees of punishment, calibrated to their level of cooperation with enemy forces. The financial aspects of Sulla's settlement arrangements revealed the practical considerations that necessarily accompanied any restoration of Roman authority. Massive indemnities imposed on communities that had supported Pontus, combined with favorable commercial arrangements for those that demonstrated renewed loyalty. The military situation in early 85 BC had evolved to the point where Mithridates faced increasing pressure to seek negotiated settlement rather than continue a conflict that was depleting his resources without achieving decisive results. Roman control of Greece had eliminated his forward bases in the western Aegean, while growing unrest within Asia Minor itself indicated that his initial popularity among Greek populations was beginning to erode under the pressures of sustained warfare. Intelligence reports reaching Pontic headquarters described widespread war weariness among civilian populations who had initially welcomed liberation from Roman rule, but now faced the reality of military conscription, increased taxation, and economic disruption caused by the continuing conflict. The king's strategic position had been further complicated by developments in other theaters that required attention and resources. Parthian forces probing operations along Pontus's eastern frontiers, barbarian tribes in the Caucasus region launching raids against Pontic territories. Diplomatic contacts between the opposing sides began through intermediaries during the winter of 86 to 85 BC. Both Sulla and Mithridates recognized that their respective positions contained both strengths and vulnerabilities that made negotiated settlement potentially attractive. The formal negotiations that led to the Treaty of Dardanus were conducted at a site chosen for its symbolic neutrality, located on the Asian shore of the Dardanelles. The treaty terms that emerged reflected the military realities that had developed over the course of the war, while acknowledging the political necessities that both sides faced. Mithridates utilized the interwar period that followed the Treaty of Dardanus to implement comprehensive military and administrative reforms designed to address the weaknesses that had been revealed during the recent conflict. The king's analysis of Roman tactical superiority led to fundamental changes in Pontic military organization, as traditional formations based on Hellenistic models were gradually replaced with units trained and equipped according to Roman standards. Pontic workshops began producing standardized weapons and armor that matched Roman specifications, while training programs introduced disciplinary methods and tactical doctrines derived from careful study of Roman military practices. The recruitment policies implemented during this period reflected Mithridates' recognition that future success would require military forces capable of matching Roman legions in both individual combat effectiveness and unit cohesion. Traditional reliance on levies from subject populations was supplemented with professional soldiers recruited from throughout the Black Sea region and trained according to rigorous standards that emphasized physical conditioning, weapons proficiency, and unit discipline. These reforms required substantial financial investment, but created military capabilities that would prove significantly more effective in future conflicts. The diplomatic initiatives that Mithridates pursued during the interwar period demonstrated his understanding that Pontus could not successfully challenge Roman power through military means alone. Embassies were dispatched to courts throughout the Mediterranean world, seeking partners who shared interests in limiting Roman expansion, while agents worked to establish contact with anti-Roman factions within territories under Roman control. The most significant of these diplomatic initiatives involved negotiations with Quintus Sertorius, the Roman general who had established an independent state in Spain following his opposition to Sulla's constitutional reforms. Sertorius represented both a potential military ally and a source of Roman military expertise that could assist in modernizing Pontic forces. The alliance that eventually emerged provided Mithridates with access to Roman military advisors and advanced weapons technology, while offering Sertorius potential support for his own operations against the Roman government. The intelligence networks that Mithridates expanded throughout the Roman world during this period would prove crucial to the timing and coordination of future military operations. Agents operating under commercial or diplomatic cover established contacts within Greek communities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, while others worked to identify potential supporters within Roman territories. The uneasy peace established by the Treaty of Dardanus lasted barely 2 years before Roman ambition and Pontic preparations converged to reignite hostilities in Asia Minor. The catalyst for renewed conflict emerged not from calculated policy decisions, but from the personal ambitions of Lucius Licinius Murena, the Roman governor of Asia, who viewed Mithridates' apparent compliance with treaty obligations as evidence of weakness rather than diplomatic prudence. Murena's unauthorized military operations against Pontus during 83 BC achieved initial tactical success as surprised Pontic garrisons found themselves overwhelmed by superior numbers. But the governor had fundamentally misread the situation. Mithridates' restraint reflected careful calculation rather than weakness. The king was waiting for his military reforms to be completed before resuming the conflict on more favorable terms. The Battle of Halys marked the first significant engagement between Roman and Pontic forces since the conclusion of the previous war. Murena had positioned approximately 8,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry in a defensive position, expecting that Pontic forces would attempt a direct assault. Instead, Mithridates' commanders implemented a sophisticated flanking maneuver that exploited their superior knowledge of local terrain. The Pontic assault began before dawn with diversionary attacks that drew attention away from the main effort developing against the Roman left flank. The primary attacking force, approximately 12,000 infantry organized in formations that closely resembled Roman legionary structure, advanced through difficult terrain that Roman scouts had dismissed as impassable. These troops, trained according to the reformed standards Mithridates had implemented, demonstrated both individual fighting skills and unit cohesion that surprised Roman commanders. The collapse of the Roman left flank occurred within hours. Murena's attempts to redeploy his reserves were frustrated by continuing diversionary attacks that prevented him from accurately assessing the scale and direction of the main enemy effort. The Roman withdrawal was conducted in good order, despite the tactical defeat, but the engagement demonstrated that Mithridates had succeeded in creating military forces capable of defeating Roman units under favorable conditions. Sulla's personal intervention ended this brief, second Mithridatic war through diplomatic pressure rather than military force. The dictator, recognizing that renewed full-scale war would require resources Rome could not afford to commit, ordered Murena to cease offensive operations and withdraw to his original positions. The peace that followed was even more fragile than before. Both sides now knew that the next war would be decisive. The death of Nicomedes IV of Bithynia in the winter of 75 BC created the precise opportunity that Mithridates had been anticipating throughout the decade of uneasy peace. The Bithynian king's final testament bequeathed his entire kingdom to the Roman people, a gesture that would create a direct territorial border between Pontus and Roman provincial administration for the first time. The Roman Senate's decision to accept the Bithynian bequest was influenced by intelligence reports indicating that Mithridates was already implementing military preparations that suggested aggressive intentions regardless of Roman actions. Pontic agents had been active throughout Asia Minor, establishing contact with anti-Roman factions while conducting detailed reconnaissance of Roman military dispositions. Mithridates received confirmation of Roman intentions through his extensive intelligence network several weeks before official announcements were made in Rome, allowing him to accelerate military preparations that had been developing systematically throughout the interwar period. The king's strategic planning for the anticipated Third War reflected lessons learned from previous conflicts, particularly the recognition that successful resistance to Roman power required coordinated operations across multiple theaters. The cornerstone of Mithridates' strategic vision was a formal military alliance with Tigranes II of Armenia, whose expanding kingdom had emerged as the dominant power in the eastern Anatolian highlands. Tigranes commanded substantial military resources, including the renowned Armenian heavy cavalry, while his territorial acquisitions in Syria and Mesopotamia provided strategic depth and additional sources of military recruitment. The alliance with Mediterranean pirates represented perhaps the most innovative element of Mithridates' strategic planning. These maritime forces controlled sea routes throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while possessing the naval capabilities necessary to disrupt Roman communications and supply lines. Their fleets, operating from secure bases throughout the Aegean Islands and the southern Anatolian coast, had achieved effective control over commercial shipping. The coordination of these diverse alliance partners required sophisticated diplomatic and military planning that demonstrated Mithridates' evolution from a regional strongman into a strategic leader capable of organizing resistance to Roman power on an unprecedented scale. The invasion of Bithynia commenced in the spring of 74 BC, with coordinated assaults that demonstrated both the scale of Pontic military capabilities and the effectiveness of strategic planning. The main Pontic army, numbering approximately 150,000 infantry and 16,000 cavalry, advanced directly from Pontus toward the Bithynian capital at Nicomedia, while secondary forces moved through Paphlagonia and along coastal routes to secure key strategic positions. The speed of Pontic success in the opening phases reflected both superior numbers and better intelligence about Roman defensive arrangements. Bithynian cities that had reluctantly accepted Roman administration welcomed Pontic forces as liberators, while Roman garrisons found themselves isolated and outnumbered. The siege of Chalcedon demonstrated the improvements in Pontic siege capabilities achieved through systematic study of Roman engineering techniques. The city fell within 2 weeks, providing Pontic forces with a crucial strategic position controlling access to the Propontis. Rome's response would require a commander capable of matching Mithridates' strategic vision with tactical brilliance and administrative competence. That commander was about to arrive. The appointment of Lucius Licinius Lucullus and Marcus Aurelius Cotta as joint commanders of Roman forces in the east represented a calculated response to the unprecedented scale of the Mithridatic threat. Yet the division of authority would soon prove problematic, as the two commanders pursued divergent strategic approaches. Lucullus brought to his command a methodical approach to warfare that emphasized careful preparation, superior logistics, and the systematic reduction of enemy capabilities through sustained pressure rather than decisive battles. His previous experience as Sulla's quaestor during the First Mithridatic War had provided him with detailed knowledge of Pontic military organization and strategic capabilities. The initial Roman strategic assessment revealed the magnitude of the challenge facing the Republic's eastern commanders. Mithridates had succeeded in creating a coordinated alliance network that could threaten Roman interests across multiple theaters simultaneously. Intelligence reports indicated that Pontic forces in Bithynia numbered at least 150,000 infantry and 16,000 cavalry, while Armenian armies under Tigranes commanded additional substantial forces. Lucullus recognized that traditional Roman tactical superiority would prove insufficient against an enemy who had learned from previous defeats and implemented comprehensive military reforms. The Pontic forces that had invaded Bithynia displayed discipline and organizational capabilities that approached Roman standards, while their equipment and weapons reflected systematic improvements. The siege of Cyzicus, which began in late 74 BC, would provide the first major test of both Pontic military improvements and Roman adaptive capabilities. Mithridates had concentrated approximately 300,000 troops around this crucial Greek city, whose strategic position on the Propontis made it essential for controlling communications between Asia Minor and European territories. The fortifications surrounding Cyzicus had been strengthened extensively, incorporating both traditional Greek defensive features and Roman engineering innovations. The city's position on a peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus provided natural defensive advantages, while its harbor facilities allowed continued communication with potential relief forces. Mithridates' siege methodology demonstrated sophisticated military engineering capabilities. Rather than relying solely on direct assault, Pontic engineers implemented a comprehensive investment that included elaborate circumvallation works designed to prevent any possibility of relief. These fortifications, constructed according to Roman engineering principles but incorporating defensive innovations, created a double ring of obstacles, protecting the besieging forces. The scale of the Pontic siege works rivaled the most ambitious Roman engineering projects, requiring the coordinated labor of tens of thousands of workers over several months. The outer ring extended for nearly 20 miles, incorporating natural terrain features while creating artificial obstacles that would prevent any relief force from approaching without first reducing the Pontic siege lines. Lucullus's response revealed the innovative tactical thinking that would characterize his eastern campaigns. Rather than direct assault on the Pontic siege lines, the Roman commander implemented a strategy combining naval operations with coordinated attacks on Pontic supply lines, designed to force Mithridates to abandon the siege through logistical pressure rather than military defeat. The naval blockade that Cotta established around the Propontis represented the first successful Roman challenge to Pontic maritime supremacy since the beginning of the current war. Roman squadrons operating from bases in the Aegean Islands implemented coordinated patrol patterns that interdicted Pontic supply ships while protecting their own communications. The gradual tightening of Roman naval control created increasing logistical difficulties for Mithridates' massive army. The Pontic army's size, which had initially appeared to guarantee rapid success, became a strategic liability as Roman naval pressure reduced available supplies, while winter weather complicated overland transportation. Lucullus exploited these developing vulnerabilities through carefully coordinated attacks on enemy supply convoys and communication lines. Roman cavalry units supported by local auxiliaries conducted systematic raids against Pontic supply trains, while maintaining sufficient mobility to avoid retaliation by superior enemy forces. The psychological impact of these sustained operations began manifesting in declining morale among Pontic forces as the siege extended into winter months without achieving decisive progress. The multinational composition of Mithridates' army became a source of internal tension as different ethnic groups blamed each other for the campaign's disappointing results. The breakthrough came during the spring of 73 BC, when coordinated naval and land attacks succeeded in severing the primary Pontic supply routes, while simultaneously threatening the siege army's lines of retreat. The collapse of the Pontic position occurred with shocking rapidity once Roman forces achieved their initial breakthrough, as Mithridates discovered that his elaborate siege works had become a trap preventing effective withdrawal. Contemporary sources describe the retreat as one of the most complete military disasters in ancient warfare, with Pontic losses exceeding 200,000 casualties from all causes including combat, disease, and desertion. The destruction of Mithridates' primary field army eliminated the offensive capabilities that had enabled Pontic expansion, while demonstrating to potential allies that Roman military power remained formidable. The systematic conquest of Pontus proper began in earnest during 72 BC, as Lucullus advanced methodically through the kingdom's border regions. The Roman approach emphasized careful preparation and overwhelming local superiority, rather than rapid advances that might expose Roman forces to counterattack. The siege of Sinope, Pontus's principal port city and administrative center, demonstrated the sophisticated siege techniques Roman engineers had developed. The city's massive walls presented formidable obstacles requiring coordinated assault techniques, employing both traditional siege engines and innovative approaches to undermining defensive structures. The operation required 8 months, but resulted in the capture of one of the most important strategic positions in the Black Sea region. The fall of Sinope was accompanied by systematic destruction of Pontic naval facilities and commercial infrastructure that eliminated the kingdom's capacity for maritime operations. Lucullus's treatment of the captured city reflected his understanding that excessive brutality might encourage desperate resistance elsewhere. He permitted the civilian population to retain their property while requiring only political submission to Roman authority. Mithridates' strategic retreat to Armenia during 70 BC represented a calculated decision to preserve his remaining military capabilities while seeking alliance support that might enable eventual recovery. The king recognized that continued resistance within Pontus proper would likely result in complete destruction of his remaining forces, while withdrawal to Armenian territory would provide secure bases for reorganization. The alliance between Mithridates and Tigranes II had evolved substantially since its initial formation. The Armenian king commanded approximately 100,000 infantry and 55,000 cavalry, while his control of wealthy commercial centers provided financial resources that could support sustained military operations. Lucullus's decision to pursue the war into Armenia during 69 BC represented one of the most controversial strategic choices of his entire command. His legions had already marched thousands of miles through hostile territory. Their supply lines stretched to the breaking point across the rugged landscape of eastern Anatolia. The soldiers who had followed him from the shores of the Aegean now found themselves in a world utterly alien to anything they had known, a land of towering mountains, bitter winters, and peoples who viewed Rome as nothing more than a distant rumor. Yet Lucullus pressed forward, driven by a strategic vision that his subordinates struggled to comprehend, and his enemies dismissed as madness. The Armenian capital of Tigranocerta stood as the crown jewel of Tigranes' empire, a city he had constructed to serve as a monument to his own greatness. Its walls enclosed a population forcibly relocated from conquered territories across the Near East. Greeks, Jews, Arabs, and countless others who had been torn from their ancestral homes to populate this artificial metropolis. The city's defenses were formidable, its garrison substantial, and its treasury overflowing with the accumulated wealth of Tigranes' conquests. For Lucullus, the capture of Tigranocerta would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. It would deprive Tigranes of his administrative center, liberate populations who might prove sympathetic to Rome, and demonstrate that Armenian power was as hollow as the forced grandeur of its capital. The march toward Tigranocerta tested the limits of Roman military capability. Lucullus led approximately 15,000 legionaries and perhaps 6,000 cavalry, a force that seemed laughably small compared to the vast armies that Tigranes could theoretically mobilize. The terrain offered no comfort to the advancing Romans. Rivers swollen with mountain snowmelt blocked their path, requiring the construction of temporary bridges that consumed precious time and resources. Mountain passes funneled the army into vulnerable columns, where ambush seemed inevitable. Local populations, whether through loyalty to Tigranes or simple fear of retribution, provided no assistance and often actively hindered the Roman advance by destroying food stores and poisoning wells. Yet Lucullus's greatest asset proved to be the very arrogance that had led Tigranes to dismiss the Roman threat. The Armenian king had grown so accustomed to easy victories over weaker neighbors that he had lost the capacity to recognize genuine danger. When messengers brought word of the Roman advance, Tigranes reportedly executed the first bearer of bad news, ensuring that subsequent reports were carefully sanitized to minimize the apparent threat. This self-imposed ignorance meant that Tigranes failed to concentrate his forces or prepare adequate defenses until the Romans were already approaching his capital. The Battle of Tigranocerta, fought on October 6, 69 BC, would become one of the most celebrated Roman victories of the Republican era, a tactical masterpiece that military theorists would study for centuries. Tigranes had finally assembled his army. Ancient sources claim anywhere from 150,000 to 300,000 men, though modern historians suggest figures closer to 80,000 to 100,000 as more realistic. Even at the lower estimates, the Armenians outnumbered the Romans by roughly 5 to 1, odds that should have guaranteed victory for the defenders. Lucullus positioned his forces on the western bank of the Tigris River, using the waterway to protect one flank while anchoring the other on rising ground. The Armenian army deployed on the opposite bank, its sheer mass creating a spectacle designed to intimidate the outnumbered Romans. Tigranes, surveying the enemy force from his elevated position, allegedly remarked that the Romans were too many for an embassy but too few for an army, a quip that would soon prove catastrophically premature. The Roman commander recognized that conventional tactics would lead to certain defeat. His infantry, however disciplined, could not withstand being enveloped by vastly superior numbers in a straightforward engagement. Instead, Lucullus devised a plan that exploited the specific weaknesses of the Armenian military system. Tigranes' army, for all its impressive size, was built around heavy cavalry, cataphracts armored from head to toe in scale mail, mounted on horses similarly protected. These units were devastating on the charge, but slow to maneuver and vulnerable if their momentum could be disrupted. Lucullus personally led his cavalry in a flanking maneuver that targeted the Armenian cataphracts before they could build charging speed. The Roman horsemen, lighter and more maneuverable than their armored opponents, swept around the Armenian flank and struck the cataphracts from an unexpected angle. Unable to turn quickly in their heavy armor, the Armenian cavalry found themselves attacked from a direction their equipment was not designed to defend. Panic spread through the cataphract formations as horses stumbled and riders fell, their protective armor becoming death traps as they struggled to rise under its crushing weight. The collapse of the Armenian cavalry triggered a cascade of disasters throughout Tigranes' army. The infantry formations, composed largely of levied troops with minimal training, had been positioned behind the cavalry screen, with the expectation that the cataphracts would shatter the Roman line before infantry engagement became necessary. When the cavalry fled in disorder, crashing through their own infantry formations, the foot soldiers found themselves suddenly exposed to Roman attack without psychological preparation or tactical positioning. The legions advanced with methodical precision, their disciplined formations cutting through the disordered Armenian masses like a blade through cloth. The rout became absolute. Armenian soldiers threw down their weapons and fled in every direction, pursued by Roman cavalry, who cut down thousands in the chaotic retreat. Tigranes himself barely escaped the disaster, losing his royal diadem in the flight and reportedly tearing his robes in grief and shame. The casualties were staggering. Ancient sources claim over 100,000 Armenian dead against Roman losses of perhaps 100 killed and wounded. Even accounting for the inevitable exaggeration of ancient battle reports, the disparity was extraordinary, a testament to the devastating effectiveness of Lucullus's tactical innovation. Tigranocerta fell shortly after the battle, its garrison demoralized and its walls inadequately defended. Lucullus allowed the forcibly relocated populations to return to their homelands, a gesture that earned him gratitude throughout the region and undermined Tigranes' legitimacy as a ruler. The treasury of the Armenian king fell into Roman hands, providing resources that would fund continued operations and enrich Lucullus personally to an almost legendary degree. The campaign seemed to have achieved everything Lucullus could have hoped. The Armenian threat neutralized, Mithridates' most powerful ally humiliated, and Roman prestige elevated to unprecedented heights in the eastern Mediterranean. But the seeds of future disaster had already been planted in the very completeness of Lucullus's victory. His soldiers, who had endured years of hard campaigning with the promise of eventual reward, watched as their commander accumulated vast personal wealth, while their own compensation remained uncertain. The harsh discipline that Lucullus maintained, necessary for military effectiveness but deeply resented by troops far from home, created a reservoir of grievance that would eventually overflow. And in the mountains of Armenia, Mithridates and Tigranes were already planning their response to the catastrophe at Tigranocerta. The winter of 69 to 68 BC found Lucullus at the apex of his military career, master of a vast territory stretching from the Aegean to the Armenian highlands. His victories had exceeded anything achieved by Roman commanders in the east since the legendary campaigns of Scipio Africanus against Carthage. The Senate, despite the political machinations of his enemies, had been forced to acknowledge his achievements with official thanksgivings and the promise of a triumph upon his return. Yet Lucullus understood, perhaps better than anyone, how precarious his position truly was. The war remained unfinished, his enemies in Rome grew bolder with each passing month, and his own army showed increasing signs of the discontent that would eventually destroy his command. Mithridates had survived the disaster at Tigranocerta and immediately began working to reverse its consequences. The old king's resilience remained his most remarkable characteristic. Where lesser men would have accepted defeat and sought terms, Mithridates saw only temporary setback and future opportunity. He recognized that Lucullus's greatest vulnerability lay not in military weakness, but in political isolation. The Roman commander had made powerful enemies through his strict enforcement of debt regulations in Asia, his refusal to share plunder generously with his officers, and his apparent indifference to the political realities that governed Roman military appointments. These weaknesses could be exploited through patience and careful manipulation. The king's agents in Rome worked tirelessly to undermine Lucullus's position. They cultivated relationships with the publicani, the tax collectors and financiers, whose profits Lucullus had curtailed through his debt reforms. They whispered to ambitious politicians that Lucullus was deliberately prolonging the war to maintain his command and continue enriching himself. They spread rumors among the common people that Roman soldiers were suffering needlessly in distant mountains while their commander lived in luxury. The campaign of political sabotage was as carefully planned as any military operation, and considerably more effective. Meanwhile, Mithridates worked to rebuild the military coalition that Tigranocerta had shattered. Tigranes, humiliated but not destroyed, remained committed to the alliance, his hatred of Rome now personal as well as political. The Armenian king still commanded substantial resources, and the mountainous terrain of his homeland offered defensive advantages that could neutralize Roman tactical superiority. Other regional powers, watching the conflict with calculating eyes, began to reconsider their positions. The Parthian Empire, the greatest power in the Near East, had thus far remained neutral, but Mithridates' diplomats worked to convince them that Roman expansion threatened their interests as surely as it threatened Pontus and Armenia. Lucullus, aware of these machinations, but unable to counter them effectively from his distant position, chose to press forward with military operations in hopes that decisive victory would silence his critics. In 68 BC, he launched a campaign against Artaxata, the ancient Armenian capital located in the heart of Tigranes' kingdom. The strategic logic was sound. The capture of Artaxata would complete the destruction of Armenian power and eliminate any possibility of Tigranes continuing the war. But the operational challenges were immense, requiring a march of hundreds of miles through hostile territory as winter approached. The campaign toward Artaxata marked the beginning of Lucullus's downfall. His soldiers, already exhausted from years of continuous warfare, faced conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The Armenian highlands offered no shelter from bitter winds that cut through Roman cloaks like knives. Food supplies dwindled as the army moved beyond the reach of its supply lines, forcing soldiers to subsist on whatever they could forage from an increasingly barren landscape. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, while disease spread through camps where sanitation became impossible to maintain. The legionaries' discontent, simmering for months, finally boiled over into open resistance. Soldiers began refusing orders, gathering in groups to voice grievances that their officers could not address. The complaints were numerous and legitimate: years of service without adequate compensation, harsh discipline applied without apparent purpose, a commander who seemed more interested in personal glory than the welfare of his men. Lucullus, whose aristocratic temperament had never inclined him toward the common touch that successful Roman commanders cultivated, found himself unable to restore the bond of trust that military effectiveness required. The mutiny forced Lucullus to abandon the Artaxata campaign and retreat toward more defensible positions. This withdrawal, militarily prudent but politically catastrophic, provided his enemies in Rome with the ammunition they needed. Reports reached the Senate describing a commander who had lost control of his army, whose ambition had led Roman soldiers to disaster in frozen wastelands, whose judgment could no longer be trusted. The political knives that had been sharpening for years now found their target. The Senate's response was devastating. Lucullus's command was progressively stripped away, his provinces reassigned to other governors, his authority undermined by contradictory orders and deliberate obstruction. The legions that had conquered Pontus and humbled Armenia were transferred to other commanders or simply allowed to disintegrate through neglect. By 67 BC, Lucullus retained only a shadow of his former power, watching helplessly as the achievements of years of brilliant campaigning crumbled around him. Mithridates, observing these developments with the patience of a predator watching wounded prey, recognized that his moment had finally arrived. The king, who had been reduced to a fugitive, dependent on his son-in-law's charity, now saw the path to restoration opening before him. Roman political dysfunction had accomplished what Armenian armies could not: the neutralization of the one commander capable of destroying Pontic power permanently. With Lucullus effectively removed from the equation, Mithridates prepared to reclaim everything he had lost. The Pontic counteroffensive of 67 BC demonstrated that Mithridates had lost none of his military capability during his years of exile. Moving with a speed that caught the Romans completely off guard, the king's forces swept back into Pontus, overwhelming the scattered garrisons that Lucullus had left behind. Cities that had submitted to Rome now faced the terrible choice between resistance and accommodation, and most, remembering the massacres that had followed previous Roman victories, chose to welcome Mithridates as a liberator rather than risk his vengeance as a conqueror. The reconquest of Pontus proceeded with remarkable swiftness. Roman forces, demoralized by the collapse of unified command and uncertain of their orders, offered only sporadic resistance. Mithridates' veterans, fighting for their homeland with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant annihilation, displayed a ferocity that overwhelmed opposition. Within months, the king had recovered most of his ancestral territory, erasing years of Roman conquest as if it had never occurred. The disaster in the east forced Rome to confront an uncomfortable reality. The war against Mithridates, which optimists had declared essentially won, was now further from conclusion than ever. The king, who should have been a broken fugitive, instead commanded a resurgent kingdom, his alliance with Armenia intact, his treasury replenished by reconquered territories, his army rebuilt and eager for revenge. Rome needed a new approach, a new commander, and a new strategy, and the man who would provide all three was already positioning himself to seize the opportunity. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, had spent the years of Lucullus's eastern campaigns building a reputation as Rome's most capable military commander. His victories in Spain against the rebel Sertorius, his brutal suppression of the Spartacus slave revolt, and most recently his spectacular campaign against the Mediterranean pirates had established him as the indispensable man of Roman politics. When the crisis in the east demanded resolution, Pompey's supporters moved quickly to secure him the command that would crown his career with unprecedented glory. The Lex Manilia of 66 BC granted Pompey powers that no Roman commander had ever possessed. He received authority over all Roman forces in the east, the right to make war and peace without senatorial approval, and control over territories stretching from the borders of Egypt to the shores of the Black Sea. The law represented a fundamental departure from republican traditions of shared command and limited tenure, a precedent that would eventually contribute to the republic's destruction. But in the crisis of the moment, such concerns seemed abstract compared to the urgent need for unified, effective leadership against Mithridates. Pompey arrived in the east during the summer of 66 BC, bringing with him not only fresh troops, but a fundamentally different approach to the war. Where Lucullus had relied on tactical brilliance and personal leadership, Pompey emphasized overwhelming force and systematic organization. Where Lucullus had alienated potential allies through rigid adherence to principle, Pompey cultivated relationships with local powers through flexible diplomacy and generous terms. The contrast in methods would produce dramatically different results. The new commander's first priority was the neutralization of Armenian support for Mithridates. Pompey recognized that the Pontic king's resilience depended heavily on his alliance with Tigranes. Without Armenian resources and sanctuary, Mithridates would be reduced to a fugitive with no hope of recovery. Rather than attempting another costly invasion of Armenia, Pompey opened diplomatic channels with Tigranes, offering terms that the Armenian king found impossible to refuse. The negotiations revealed Pompey's political genius. He offered Tigranes recognition as a legitimate king and Roman ally, retention of Armenia proper, and protection against his own rebellious son, who had allied with the Parthians in hopes of seizing the throne. In exchange, Tigranes would abandon Mithridates, surrender his conquests outside Armenia, and pay a substantial indemnity to Rome. The terms were harsh but survivable, far better than the complete destruction that continued resistance would bring. Tigranes, exhausted by years of warfare and facing threats from multiple directions, accepted the offer and formally broke his alliance with Pontus. The defection of Armenia transformed the strategic situation completely. Mithridates, who had rebuilt his position on the assumption of continued Armenian support, suddenly found himself isolated and vulnerable. His kingdom, recovered with such effort, now faced Roman attack without the possibility of external assistance. The Parthians, who had shown some interest in opposing Roman expansion, drew back from commitment once Tigranes made peace. Other regional powers, reading the shifting winds of fortune, hastened to assure Pompey of their friendship and cooperation. Pompey's campaign against Mithridates combined military pressure with psychological warfare designed to break the king's will to resist. Roman forces advanced into Pontus from multiple directions, systematically reducing strongholds and cutting supply lines. Pompey made clear that generous terms awaited those who surrendered promptly, while those who resisted would face the full severity of Roman vengeance. The policy produced a steady stream of defections as Mithridates' supporters calculated that their futures lay with Rome rather than with a king whose cause appeared increasingly hopeless. The decisive confrontation came near the Lycus River in 66 BC, where Pompey caught Mithridates' army in a night attack that shattered Pontic resistance. The battle itself was less a tactical masterpiece than a demonstration of overwhelming force applied at the moment of maximum enemy vulnerability. Mithridates' troops, surprised in their camps and unable to form coherent defensive positions, were cut down in the darkness by Roman soldiers, who showed no mercy to enemies they had been fighting for over 2 decades. The king himself escaped the disaster with only a small bodyguard, fleeing northward toward the Caucasus Mountains and the distant shores of the Crimean Bosporus. The pursuit of Mithridates took Pompey into regions that no Roman army had ever penetrated. He led his forces through the wild valleys of the Caucasus, encountering peoples who had never heard of Rome and cared nothing for the political struggles of the Mediterranean world. The campaign became as much an exploration as a military operation, with Pompey's officers recording observations about geography, ethnography, and natural resources that would inform Roman understanding of the region for generations. The commander himself seemed to relish the role of discoverer, adding new territories to Roman knowledge, even as he hunted the fugitive king. But Mithridates remained elusive, always one step ahead of his pursuers, his knowledge of the terrain and his network of loyal supporters enabling him to slip through every Roman net. The king crossed the Caucasus into the lands of the Colchians, then continued northward to the Greek cities of the Crimean Bosporus, where his son Machares ruled as a Roman client. The journey covered thousands of miles through some of the most inhospitable terrain on earth, a testament to Mithridates' extraordinary physical endurance and unbreakable determination. Pompey, recognizing that further pursuit would yield diminishing returns, chose to consolidate his gains rather than chase Mithridates to the ends of the earth. The Roman commander turned his attention to the reorganization of the East, a task that would occupy him for the next several years and establish the administrative framework that would govern the region for centuries. Mithridates, isolated in his Crimean refuge, seemed to pose no further threat, a broken old man whose dreams of empire had finally been extinguished by Roman power. Yet the king refused to accept that his story had ended. Even in exile, even stripped of his kingdom and abandoned by his allies, Mithridates continued to plan and scheme for the destruction of Rome. His final years would produce one last desperate gamble, a plan so audacious that it seemed to border on madness, yet so carefully conceived that it might, under different circumstances, have changed the course of history. The Crimean Bosporus, where Mithridates established his final refuge, was a land that seemed designed for last stands and desperate ventures. The Greek cities that dotted its shores had been founded centuries earlier by colonists seeking new opportunities far from the crowded politics of the Aegean world. They had prospered through trade in grain, fish, and slaves, developing a hybrid culture that blended Greek sophistication with the warrior traditions of the Scythian steppes. For Mithridates, this remote corner of his former empire offered both sanctuary and possibility, a base from which he might yet strike back at the enemies who had taken everything else. The king's arrival in the Bosporus precipitated an immediate crisis. His son Machares, who had ruled the region as a Roman client since Lucullus's campaigns, faced an impossible choice between filial loyalty and political survival. Machares had prospered under Roman protection, and he understood that welcoming his father would mean war with Pompey, a war that the Bosporan kingdom could not hope to win. Yet refusing sanctuary to Mithridates would mean betraying his own blood, an act that would mark him as a traitor in the eyes of his subjects and potentially provoke a popular uprising. Machares chose Rome and paid for that choice with his life. When Mithridates approached the Bosporan cities, Machares fled rather than face his father's wrath, eventually taking his own life when escape proved impossible. The kingdom fell into Mithridates' hands without significant resistance, its population welcoming the legendary king whose name had become synonymous with resistance to Roman domination. For a brief moment, it seemed that Mithridates had found the foundation for yet another comeback. The king immediately set about transforming his new domain into a military base capable of threatening Roman interests. He imposed heavy taxes on the Bosporan cities, conscripted their young men into his army, and began accumulating the resources necessary for large-scale military operations. His plan, which emerged gradually over the following months, was breathtaking in its ambition. Mithridates intended to march overland through Scythia and Thrace, cross the Danube into the Celtic lands of Central Europe, gather barbarian allies along the way, and descend upon Italy itself through the Alpine passes. He would become a new Hannibal, bringing war to Rome's doorstep and avenging decades of humiliation through the destruction of the city that had caused him so much suffering. The plan was not entirely fantastic. The route Mithridates proposed had been traveled by migrating peoples for millennia, and the barbarian tribes of the Danube region had ample reason to resent Roman expansion into their territories. A charismatic leader offering plunder and revenge might well attract substantial following among peoples who had watched Roman power grow with increasing alarm. And Rome itself, exhausted by decades of civil conflict and foreign wars, might prove more vulnerable than its reputation suggested. The plan required everything to go right, but Mithridates had built his career on making the impossible possible. Yet the king who conceived this audacious scheme was no longer the vigorous warrior who had massacred Romans at Ephesus or defied Sulla's legions in Greece. Mithridates was now in his late 60s, his body worn by decades of warfare, assassination attempts, and the accumulated stress of ruling an empire under constant threat. His mind remained sharp, his will unbroken, but the physical capacity to lead armies on thousand-mile marches through hostile territory had diminished with age. More critically, the charisma that had once inspired absolute loyalty now competed with a paranoia that had grown more pronounced with each betrayal he had suffered. The king's suspicion fell most heavily on his own family. Mithridates had fathered numerous children by various wives and concubines, and he had learned through bitter experience that blood ties offered no guarantee of loyalty. Sons had rebelled against him, daughters had been used as pawns in diplomatic games, and the question of succession had become a source of constant anxiety. In his final years, this anxiety curdled into something darker, a conviction that everyone around him, including his own children, was plotting his destruction. The breaking point came through his son Pharnaces, who had accompanied his father into Crimean exile, and initially appeared to be a loyal supporter of the planned Italian campaign. But Pharnaces, watching his father's increasingly erratic behavior and recognizing the impossibility of the proposed march on Rome, began to consider alternatives. The young prince understood that his own future depended on reaching an accommodation with Roman power, and that such accommodation would be impossible as long as his father lived. The conspiracy that Pharnaces organized drew support from virtually every element of Mithridates' remaining court. Soldiers who had followed the king for decades now questioned whether his plans offered any realistic hope of success. Nobles who had lost everything in the wars against Rome saw no prospect of recovery through continued resistance. Even members of the royal household, bound to Mithridates by ties of blood and service, concluded that the king's death offered the only path to survival. The conspiracy grew until it encompassed nearly everyone in the king's inner circle, yet Mithridates, despite his legendary paranoia, failed to detect the danger until it was too late. The revolt began in 63 BC, when Pharnaces persuaded the army to declare him king and march against his father's stronghold. Mithridates, trapped in his citadel with only a handful of loyal guards, watched as the soldiers who had served him for decades turned their backs and acclaimed his son as their new ruler. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Not a single unit remained loyal to the king who had led them through so many campaigns, who had shared their hardships and celebrated their victories, who had embodied their hopes for a world free from Roman domination. The end came with a dignity that matched the grandeur of Mithridates' life. Recognizing that capture would mean humiliation, torture, and eventual execution in a Roman triumph, the king chose to die by his own hand. He distributed poison to his daughters and remaining companions, watching as they died before attempting to take the same dose himself. But here, in a final irony that seemed to encapsulate his entire existence, Mithridates' legendary immunity to poison, cultivated through decades of deliberate exposure, prevented the toxin from taking effect. The king, who had survived countless assassination attempts, found that he could not kill himself through the method he had spent his life mastering. In the end, Mithridates was forced to order one of his Celtic bodyguards to finish what the poison could not accomplish. The soldier, bound by oaths of loyalty that transcended the political calculations consuming everyone else, drove his sword through the king's body. Mithridates, the sixth Eupator, the last great enemy of Republican Rome, died as he had lived, defiant, unconquered in spirit, and determined to deny his enemies the satisfaction of taking his life on their terms. The death of Mithridates sent shockwaves through the ancient world, marking the end of an era that had shaped Mediterranean politics for over 4 decades. Pharnaces, eager to secure Roman recognition of his usurpation, sent his father's body to Pompey as proof that the great enemy was finally dead. The Roman commander, who had spent years hunting the Pontic king, reportedly treated the corpse with respect, ordering proper burial and acknowledging the greatness of the adversary whose destruction had crowned his own career. It was a gesture that recognized what everyone understood. Mithridates had been no ordinary enemy, but a figure whose resistance had tested Roman power to its limits and revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Republic's imperial system. Pompey's settlement of the East, completed in the years following Mithridates' death, transformed the political geography of the ancient world. The Roman commander created new provinces, established client kingdoms, founded cities, and imposed an administrative order that would endure for centuries. Syria became a Roman province, ending the last remnants of Seleucid power. Judea was reorganized under Roman supervision, beginning the troubled relationship between Rome and the Jewish people that would culminate in the destruction of Jerusalem over a century later. The Greek cities of Asia received new charters that balanced local autonomy with Roman oversight. Throughout the region, Pompey's arrangements reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to maintain control over diverse populations through a combination of direct rule and indirect influence. The wealth that flowed to Rome from Pompey's eastern conquests exceeded anything in previous Roman experience. The treasury received payments that funded public works, military expenditures, and the grain distributions that kept the urban population quiescent. Individual Romans, soldiers, merchants, administrators, enriched themselves through opportunities that the new territories provided. The economic integration of the Eastern Mediterranean into the Roman system accelerated processes of cultural exchange and commercial development that would define the ancient world for generations. Yet the very completeness of Pompey's victory contained the seeds of future conflict. The extraordinary powers granted to him for the Mithridatic War had established precedents that ambitious men would exploit in the coming decades. The wealth and prestige he accumulated made him a figure whose influence rivaled that of the state itself, a situation that republican institutions were not designed to accommodate. Within 2 decades of Mithridates' death, Rome would be convulsed by civil wars that would ultimately destroy the Republic and give birth to the empire. The patterns established in the struggle against Mithridates, the concentration of military power in individual commanders, the use of Eastern wealth to fund political ambitions, the subordination of constitutional norms to military necessity, would recur with devastating consequences. The legacy of Mithridates himself proved surprisingly durable. His resistance to Rome became a model for later opponents of imperial power, from Parthian kings to Germanic chieftains to medieval chroniclers seeking examples of noble defiance against overwhelming odds. The story of his immunity to poison, whether literally true or merely legendary, entered the cultural vocabulary of the Western world, giving rise to the term Mithridatism for the practice of building tolerance to toxins through gradual exposure. His image as the last defender of Greek freedom against Roman barbarism, though historically questionable, resonated with audiences who saw in his struggle echoes of their own conflicts with dominant powers. The Pontic kingdom that Mithridates had ruled effectively ceased to exist as an independent entity. Pharnaces retained control of the Bosporan region as a Roman client, but his attempts to expand his power during Rome's civil wars would end in defeat at the hands of Julius Caesar, the victory that Caesar commemorated with his famous dispatch, Veni, Vidi, Vici. The Greek cities of the Pontic coast were absorbed into Roman provincial administration, their distinct identity gradually submerged in the broader currents of imperial culture. Within a few generations, Mithridates had become a figure of history rather than memory, his wars studied by military theorists, but his cause forgotten by populations that had found accommodation with Roman rule. The transformation of the Eastern Mediterranean under Roman control proceeded with remarkable speed once organized resistance ended. Greek remained the dominant language of culture and commerce, but Latin increasingly penetrated administrative and military spheres. Local elites learned to navigate Roman political systems, seeking citizenship and advancement through service to the imperial power. The violent resistance that Mithridates had championed gave way to a more subtle process of negotiation and adaptation, as Eastern populations discovered that Roman rule offered opportunities as well as constraints. The religious landscape of the region underwent equally significant changes. Traditional cults continued to flourish, but new religious movements, including the mystery religions that would eventually give rise to Christianity, found fertile ground in the cosmopolitan environment that Roman peace created. The mixing of populations, the movement of soldiers and merchants across vast distances, and the breakdown of traditional community structures all contributed to a spiritual ferment that would reshape human civilization. Mithridates, who had presented himself as a champion of traditional religion against Roman impiety, could not have imagined the religious transformations that would follow his defeat. The Mithridatic Wars, viewed from the perspective of subsequent history, represented a crucial turning point in the development of Roman power and the shaping of the ancient world. The conflict that began as a border dispute in distant Anatolia grew into a struggle that tested every aspect of Roman military, political, and economic capability. The lessons learned in that struggle about the management of distant provinces, the dangers of concentrated military command, the relationship between foreign conquest and domestic politics, would inform Roman policy for centuries to come. The human cost of the wars defies precise calculation, but certainly reached into the hundreds of thousands. The massacre at Ephesus alone claimed 80,000 lives according to ancient sources, and subsequent military operations, sieges, and reprisals added enormously to the toll. Entire cities were destroyed, populations displaced, economies shattered. The prosperity that the Eastern Mediterranean had enjoyed under Hellenistic rule gave way to decades of instability and violence before Roman peace finally took hold. The scars of the Mithridatic Wars remained visible in the region for generations, shaping patterns of settlement, economic activity, and political organization. Yet the wars also accelerated processes of integration and development that would ultimately benefit the region. Roman infrastructure, roads, ports, aqueducts, facilitated commerce and communication on a scale previously impossible. Roman law provided a framework for resolving disputes and protecting property that encouraged investment and economic growth. Roman military power eliminated the constant threat of warfare between rival kingdoms that had plagued the Hellenistic world. The peace that followed Mithridates' defeat, however imposed, created conditions for prosperity that the region had not known for centuries. The figure of Mithridates himself remains fascinating precisely because he embodied so many contradictions. He was a Greek king who ruled over diverse populations through a combination of Hellenistic culture and Persian tradition. He was a defender of freedom who maintained his power through ruthless suppression of dissent. He was a brilliant military commander who repeatedly snatched defeat from the jaws of victory through strategic overreach. He was a loving father who executed his own children when he suspected their loyalty. He was a man of extraordinary physical courage who spent his final years consumed by paranoia. These contradictions make him a compelling subject for historical study, but they also make definitive judgments about his character and legacy difficult to render. The Roman commanders who opposed Mithridates, Sulla, Lucullus, Pompey, each brought different strengths and weaknesses to the conflict, and each was shaped by the experience in ways that affected their subsequent careers. Sulla's Eastern command provided the military reputation and the wealth that enabled his march on Rome and his subsequent dictatorship. Lucullus's brilliant campaigns demonstrated the heights that Roman military capability could reach, but his political failures showed the limits of military excellence, divorced from political skill. Pompey's comprehensive victory established him as the dominant figure in Roman politics, setting the stage for the conflicts with Caesar that would destroy the Republic. The broader significance of the Mithridatic Wars lies in what they reveal about the nature of imperial expansion and resistance. Rome's victory was never inevitable. At multiple points, different decisions by Roman commanders or different circumstances in Roman politics might have produced very different outcomes. Mithridates came closer to defeating Rome than any enemy since Hannibal, and his failure owed as much to his own mistakes as to Roman superiority. The wars demonstrated that empires are not built through inexorable historical forces, but through the accumulated decisions of individuals operating under conditions of uncertainty and constraint. The memory of Mithridates endured in the regions he had ruled long after his death. Local traditions preserved stories of the great king who had defied Rome, embellishing his achievements and minimizing his failures, in the way that popular memory typically treats heroic figures. These traditions influenced later resistance movements and provided a vocabulary for expressing opposition to imperial power. Even today, Mithridates remains a significant figure in the historical consciousness of Turkey and the Black Sea region, his legacy claimed by various national narratives seeking ancient precedents for modern identities. The Mithridatic Wars also left their mark on Roman culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The wealth that flowed from the conquered East transformed Roman society, accelerating the growth of luxury and inequality that moralists would later blame for the Republic's decline. The military innovations developed in the Eastern campaigns influenced Roman tactical doctrine for generations. The administrative techniques refined in governing the new provinces became models for imperial organization throughout the Mediterranean world. Even Roman religion absorbed influences from the East, as soldiers and merchants brought back cults and practices that would eventually reshape the spiritual landscape of the empire. In the end, the story of Mithridates and his wars against Rome is a story about the collision between two visions of the ancient world. One centered on the diverse, competitive, culturally rich civilization of the Hellenistic East, the other on the disciplined, expansionist, ultimately homogenizing power of Rome. Mithridates' defeat marked the definitive triumph of the Roman vision, but the process of that triumph transformed Rome itself in ways that the victors could not have anticipated. The empire that emerged from the Mithridatic Wars was not the same republic that had entered them, and the changes set in motion during those decades of conflict would continue to unfold for centuries. The legacy of those wars, in politics, in culture, in the very structure of Western civilization, remains with us still. Every time we use the word Mithridatism, every time we study the campaigns of Sulla or Pompey, every time we trace the origins of the Roman Empire to the crises of the late Republic, we engage with the consequences of that long-ago struggle between a Pontic king and the power that would rule the Mediterranean world. Mithridates lost his war, but his story endures, a testament to the enduring human fascination with those who dare to resist the seemingly irresistible, who fight against odds that reason declares impossible, who refuse to surrender even when all hope has fled. In that refusal lies something that transcends the particular circumstances of ancient politics and speaks to universal aspects of the human condition. It is why, more than 2,000 years after his death, we still remember the name of Mithridates the Great.